All right. It is awesome to be here. I want to welcome everyone. Nick, why don't we start out with some quick introductions? I'll introduce myself, then I'll turn it to you. My name is Chris Hurst. I'm the Vice President for Global Risk and Intelligence Services. Just a quick bit about me. I was an Army officer from 2001 to 2006, West Point class 2001, then spent 4 years in Iraq and Afghanistan building infrastructure, had a constant challenge of needing to understand what's the reality for safety and security on the ground as I led teams of civilians, then led a risk management team at Mercy Corps, and ultimately co-founded Risk Intelligence for OnSolve in 2013, joined OnSolve officially in 2020, and since then have stood up our Global Risk Intelligence Services team. Nick, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Really excited to be here. My name is Nick Hill, and I'm an OnSolve Senior Risk Analyst, and I lead our intelligence services. My background is in risk intelligence as a security practitioner. I was a strategic intelligence officer in the Marine Corps for a number of years. After that, in the private sector, I led travel risk management, global security, and risk intelligence for the University of Washington, a number of organizations in the Pacific Northwest, and then more recently, working with technology providers to provide best-in-class software, but also thinking about how to optimize that software and provide complementary services to help you all get the most out of your technology and help keep people safe. So really excited to be here.
Thanks so much, Nick. Listen, over the last year, we have conducted more webinars with our analyst teams. And so today's webinar is really a recap from those recent discussions. Those discussions have been incredibly valuable for us as well as for our clients. And so today's focus is we're analyzing risk across Europe this summer. As many companies are thinking about their travel risk, as their teams, as their executives and their employees are planning their trips to Europe this summer for the UEFA Championships and the 2024 Paris Olympics. So this is our agenda for today. Nick is going to set the stage by covering some of the large risk in focus in Europe and risk patterns. We're then going to go into two case studies. We'll look at a case study from the 2020 UEFA European Championship in Wembley. I'll cover the 2015 Paris attacks using some of the data that we saw back in 2015. We'll then just go into some broad recommendations for travel risk management in Europe. So, Nick, let's set the stage. Why is it important to consider the risk in Europe? Why should organizations operating in Paris or with travelers in Paris care?
Yeah, there's a lot going on this summer in Europe. So the UEFA European Championships, is from June 14th to July 27th. That's expected to attract approximately 20 million visitors, 2.5 million visitors in Berlin for the final. So that's quite an influx of visitors for that event. And of course, Paris Olympics. That's scheduled to go from July 26th to 11th of August. That's expected to attract about 15.3 million visitors, right, to Paris metro area. It's this massive influx of people that really presents amplified risks, not just in these two countries, but across Western Europe. These events are also occurring on the backdrop of economic austerity and political action. So this June, the European elections will be held. And this is an important factor because elections can create localized instability, government inefficiency. It can fuel further civil unrest and incivility, right, depending on the outcome of the elections or the proposed agendas of the winning parties. This is also on the backdrop of economic austerity across Europe, right? So both in France and Germany, we see political action to pass the curtailing of subsidies, economic austerity. And so this has really created a lot of civil action, particularly in labor strikes. One of our lead analysts actually lives in Europe, and his firsthand experience has been that there's a sharp increase in labor strikes. His flights have been canceled or delayed. The transportation sector has seen a number of strikes impacting trains, buses, and taxis. So we really wanted to emphasize that as a risk to travelers. We've also seen examples of other labor strikes, such as farmers blocking rows of tractors in both Germany and France in protests against the postponement or phasing out of agricultural subsidies. And of course, in France, France has a long history of labor strikes. But 2023 marked some of the largest protests France has seen in decades. After the French government attempted to pass pension reform, the country saw weeks of nationwide strikes, protests, and even clashes with police. So this is an important backdrop. Second to that has been climate activism in Europe. We've seen large protests organized particularly by youth movements in Germany and France. And as an example, last summer, climate activists clashed with farmers at a reservoir, resulting in hundreds injured in France. And then, of course, this summer also comes at a time of political shifts and uncertainty. The US election cycle always brings heated foreign policy rhetoric, and European relations are always at the center of those debates, right? Whether it's NATO, Ukrainian defense, import taxes, or new trade agreements. And so these debates can also drive cascading risks as lone actors or organizations see major sporting events as a platform to make a statement or air a grievance. The same can be said for the continued conflicts in Gaza and Ukraine. As these conflicts develop, we may see protests related to these conflicts. And again, these sporting events, they create an international stage for these protesters. So we may see a spike in protests as we see this large influx of people and the international media attention for these sporting events. The last backdrop piece that I want to talk to is the recent terrorist attacks in Moscow. So it's Germany with UEFA, or France and the International Olympic Committee. These bodies are rethinking security for these events following these terrorist attacks. And so, for example, France has this plan of hosting their opening ceremony on the Seine River. This is the first time that the Olympic opening ceremony will be held outdoors. And so plans have been put in place to address some of the security vulnerabilities of doing a major event outdoors. For example, we know that they're going to be building an anti-terrorism buffer on the sides of the river that can create a commuting issue. It can create traffic. It can create access issues for local employees. So that's in consideration as we think about the impact. It's not just the elevated threat of terrorism with major events, but also the everyday impact that security infrastructure can have on employees and travelers.
Nick, I think this is great context. And just from, both of our backgrounds, just think about the ATFP, anti-terrorism force protection requirements for a large stretch of river with athletes from across the world moving slowly on boats. That's a big challenge. Can we jump into historic risk patterns in Europe just to give a bit more context?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to hit each of these buckets. Our team identified a number of historic and anticipated risks across Europe. These fall into three buckets: socioeconomic tension, extremism, and climate risks. So the first bucket here is socioeconomic risk, and that's about identifying risks that are endemic to Europe based on economic and societal challenges, especially in Germany and France. These risks are by no means unique to Europe, but with the large influx of visitors in these major events, it's these types of socioeconomic tensions that we're likely to see exacerbated. Civil protests and incivility, those go hand in hand. The volume and frequency of labor strikes and civil actions that we've seen in the data is pretty noteworthy. And like I said before, these major events are likely to create an opportunity, a stage for visibility. So individual actors or organizations will take advantage of these events to stage protests, air a grievance, make a statement. I want to also emphasize that the conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza also represent a protest dynamic here, right? So right, as these conflicts develop, whether they're major headlines or shifts in the conflict, that's likely to bring protesters to the streets. They see an opportunity to make a statement. And so it's worth monitoring protest activity in these countries this summer. The last risk I'll mention is a surge in opportunistic crime that often comes with those influx of visitors and density. Things like petty theft, scams, even cyber pollution can become an issue. There's also an issue of the daily risk of strained public services. So employees, working in the cities may find it harder to commute, access basic services, or even receive timely medical care. The second bucket I want to speak to is extremism. Now, certainly, we talked about the terrorist attack in Moscow and the actions that are taken by local authorities and these sporting venues to address the threat of terrorism. It can be difficult to assess with high fidelity whether the threat of terrorism will be especially elevated this summer. But significant terrorist attacks have happened in Europe in the past. We'll talk about the attacks in Paris in 2015. For Germany and France, most reported terrorist attacks involve stabbings or are primarily carried out by lone wolf actors. Other forms of extremism that are likely to impact employees include violent rhetoric from far-right extremism. We've seen far-right movements protest and make statements. The rhetoric can be hostile and alarming for employees, and we've seen both governments in France and Germany recently ban several right-wing extremist groups following violent demonstrations. The last thing I want to talk to is infrastructure disruption here. In March of this year, a pro-Russian hacker group called Anonymous Sudan was behind a series of politically motivated DDoS attacks, stands for distributed denial of service. This form of cyber terrorism targeted the French government, and it resulted in several disruptions in communication and services across the French government as those digital services went temporarily offline. So it's this kind of infrastructure disruption during these major events that could potentially impact everyday work for employees as well as your travelers. Let's move to the third bucket of risk, and that's climate risk. Over the past couple of years, we've seen in our reporting torrential rain, flash floods, terrible air quality from wildfires. What I really want to focus on today is the risk of heat. In July of 2022, for example, we saw record temperatures of over 40 degrees Celsius measured north of Hamburg and Germany, really unprecedented temperatures across Western Europe. According to the French health authorities last year, 5,000 people died over the summer due to the heat. Southern France saw record temperatures, but it's really Paris that poses the biggest risk with the heat. Researchers from various countries in Europe recently studied mortality risks due to heat and cold across 854 cities in Europe. And what they found was that Paris topped the list in heat-related risks across all age groups. So Paris had a higher likelihood of excess death, 1.6 times higher than other European cities. The thought behind this and reason why the increased risk is this urban heat island effect that is in Paris. This is caused by common building materials, density of buildings, as well as Paris's famed gray rooftops, which are made of zinc, so that it absorbs and retains the heat. Further complicating the heat risk is general lack of air conditioning in old buildings across Europe. So for teams that are looking to book alternative lodging, hotels, longer-term apartments, it's important to verify adequate air conditioning and making sure that it works properly. So that really sets the stage and highlights a number of the risks that our team dug into, found both in our OnSolve reporting as well as research on historic risks in Europe and how they're exacerbated by these major sporting events.
Nick, I think it's a great place to set the stage. Just one comment on the heat waves. From our own analysis, I recall that last summer, rooftop temperatures in Paris reached 194 degrees Fahrenheit. Water boils at 212. So it's incredibly extreme. I think this is a helpful place to start with the patterns of risk. Before we look at some of the lessons learned from our case studies, can you just cover why is OnSolve even considering this scope of analysis on behalf of our clients?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited for the opportunity that our team has had to dive into risks in Europe this summer on behalf of a number of clients that reached out to us, because really what energizes our team, the reason we're here, is about being great partners to all of our customers. We're on the same mission of building resilience together and making sure that your teams are prepared for the risks today and the risks in the future. And so OnSolve is really proud to be best-in-class technology for critical event management. But we also understand that resilience and risk management is about people. And so we really want to come alongside you to make sure that your team is getting the most out of your software, but also to address gaps in your security plans or risk management by providing that deeper analysis that we can do with the rich data from our platform, and also provide that subject matter expertise in critical event management. So really excited to provide this analysis and share with you the services that we are really excited to introduce you to. The reason that we're able to do this is part of an evolution of pursuit of excellence. And it's really the optimization of software that led us to stand up a watch center. This global team is a 24/7 security operations center that uses the OnSolve platform. The AI-powered risk intelligence, our critical communications tool, is being used every day by this team. They really focus on consuming our own technology so we can understand how to make it work for all of you. They also bring industry experience in critical event management and are really focused on optimizing our learning around best practices and standard operating procedures. We also realized that we had access to rich historic data from our OnSolve platform. So we stood up a center of excellence to take a deep look into that data and to help us do that big data analysis and visualization on behalf of all of you, and provide that deep experience with source review and ingestion. So we have this 24/7 Ops Center that is providing great feedback loops to our product team, making the software better. We have all this rich data. We realized we have a great opportunity to provide deep intelligence analysis on behalf of all your missions to keep people safe. So it's these intelligent services that we're really excited to introduce you to, and has been driving the analysis that you're seeing here today. So this is an example of the services that we're really excited to extend to your team through our internal capabilities. What you've heard today in terms of the strategic analysis of risks in Europe this summer is really powered by our strategic intelligence analysis. This is on-demand access to OnSolve analysts who provide deeper insights on trends regarding Europe or any risk landscape, location analysis, and assisting you in security planning for special events. You see also here, we offer an incident hotline. This is a dedicated hotline with 24/7 coverage. It's that first level of support, always available to your employees to call if they need assistance, whether it's lost passport or need direction about where to receive medical care. That's what that hotline is for. We also offer incident management support. This is end-to-end critical event management support that really optimizes your process for standing up your incident management team and providing you with the intelligence and the technology they needed to do that in an efficient and effective way. Lastly, we're excited to offer tabletop exercises. Part of planning for risk in Europe this summer is going through simulations for special events. Whether it's what are we going to do if there's a terrorist attack, to what are our action plan for a heat wave, tabletop exercises can really help in building resilience and being prepared. And we're excited to partner with you in accomplishing that.
Nick, this is great. I think when we looked at the case studies, let's start now with the case study for sort of a moderate risk event. And let's use the UEFA European Championship from 2020 final as a case study.
Yeah, so let me set the stage. So this is July 11th, 2021. This is the 2020 UEFA European Championships, right? Because of COVID, this tournament was postponed a year. And it's really that pandemic context that highlights what unfolded here. So this is the UEFA final against England and Italy at Wembley in London. And what happened was hundreds of individuals rushed the access points. So this power of mass movement all together, breaking through the barriers, the turnstiles, going through the gates, and then these intruders temporarily access the stadium, access the field or pitch, right? They sat in VIP seats. There were several reports of unruly behavior and drug use by these unticketed fans. So eventually 86 were arrested, 19 officers were injured. And so that is what happened. The reason that we wanted to share this case study is, one, it relates to the UEFA European Championships, which is one of the major events in Europe this summer. But also there's some really important lessons to be learned from what happened with this power of mass movement. The British government did an investigation, an after action, if you will, of what happened. They had a couple of findings that I wanted to highlight. The first was that so England lost this match in a shootout. If England had won, this would have created a much bigger public safety risk. They assessed that over 6,000 people may have stormed the stadium to celebrate because they saw what was possible with those hundreds of people that rushed the entry points and gained access. So seeing how it was possible could have encouraged a much larger crowd to rush the stadium, and that would have caused a safety concern. The second was a general collective failure by organizers and the security teams to anticipate this power of mass movement. But hindsight's 2020, and if you think about the context, how COVID protocols, people stuck indoors looking for something to celebrate, England's in the final. This is one of the first major events during the pandemic, that there may have been this need to express this angst, this frustration, maybe some socioeconomic tension there, all boiling up to a point where they rushed the stadium. And part of why they did not anticipate this sort of risk was because of the hyper focus on COVID protocols. So there was a heavy focus placed on by authorities on managing these processes for determining that vaccination status, masks, etc. And really, in order to do that, they limited the number of entry points. And the last thing I'll note is the lack of experienced stewards and security officer. Because of the pandemic, it was difficult to find enough staff for the event that had the experience of managing a crowd. So those are some of the lessons that I think jumped out to me and could be applicable for the risks we see in Europe this summer. Chris, what do you think?
I think it's a great summary of sort of the moderate risk outcome, right? And so let's now jump into something that would be much more extreme, much more severe. We'll use the 2015 Paris attacks. Look, when we had these conversations with clients live, we're just sensitive to the fact that many of our clients on these calls have lost teammates, have lost employees, and so we're sensitive to the nature. I just want to be aware of that. If we start with the context in 2015, remember this was November of 2015. The backdrop here is that the terrorist attacks in Paris came on the heels of the Charlie Hebdo attack in the headquarters in January of 2015. This was a Europe that was increasingly beleaguered by jihadist activity. You had numerous fighters returning from conflict zones, and they were often radicalized and highly trained. In 2015, we had a tech landscape where encryption and the misuse of digital communication platforms allowed threats like the terror attacks in November to multiply, really under the radar of conventional surveillance. You had the Schengen Agreement, which is a hallmark of European unity, but that inadvertently facilitates the free movement of threats across borders with really minimal security, and that complicates the landscape significantly. And then finally, you have intelligence agencies finding themselves in a real reactive stance, hamstrung by the lack of cohesive and real-time data sharing. So that's the context for where we were in November. If we move into the timeline, what we saw is on November 13, 2015, Paris was subjected to an orchestrated series of attacks, demonstrated real precision and ruthless efficiency. The terrorists were armed with assault rifles. They were strapped with suicide vests. They targeted venues that were bustling with civilians, including the National Stadium, cafes, and a concert hall. This was a multifaceted assault. It was not only synchronized to occur almost simultaneously across the attacks, but also designed to exploit psychological impact of terror to its fullest and really stretching the response capabilities of the government. If I zoom in here, what you're seeing is data that we pulled from Risk Intelligence back in November 2015 following the attacks. What we saw is that just prior to the attacks, we saw a spike in risk intelligence alerts, including a hotel bomb threat that occurred 5 hours prior and a subway evacuation immediately prior. So with these complex attacks, with multiple attacks over a large area, we may see signals of those attacks in advance. And I want to be clear: this is not Chris saying that we had insight on the most significant terrorist attacks in a generation, since 9/11. But we do see potential signals about news of evacuations or thwarted attacks. And you can think about what's the causal mechanism of this. Is there leaks to local news sources? Was there information picked up from police scanners? Was there social media observations? I think it's just an important consideration to think about, is the potential for early warning. Nick, let's talk about the similarities and differences of the Paris attacks in 2015 versus today. And I'll cover the similarities, and I'll turn to you to talk about the differences. So on the similarities side, you see the target profile. So both events present high-profile targets with significant international attention. This makes them attractive targets for terrorist groups or individuals seeking to make a statement. Second is crowd management. Both situations involve managing large crowds in urban environments. That poses logistical challenges. You talked about that with the opening ceremonies in particular. You have crowded spaces, and those crowded spaces can complicate emergency response and increase the risk of higher casualties. Three, you have the importance of psychological impact. This is the intent to cause fear and disruption among civilians is a real common thread here. With that, let's transition to differences, Nick.
Yeah, I think I'd like to highlight 5 key differences since 2015. The first is the level of security preparedness and experience. France and really most Western European countries have significantly ramped up their security infrastructure, passing legislation to improve surveillance, and are just generally improved readiness to respond to terrorist threats. Paris specifically, France has hosted several large-scale events. Paris is frequently the host of major events. And so specifically for the Olympics, I do believe that France and the international community are well prepared, and we already see a big emphasis on addressing security vulnerabilities before that opening ceremony. The scope of security measures is the second difference. Security measures during the Paris Olympics in particular are going to be far more sophisticated and extensive than they were in 2015, right? Specifically the use of advanced surveillance technology, including AI, extensive background checks, and just the general security design and thoughtfulness about what are the security vulnerabilities for specific events. The third difference is the international collaboration. The level of international security cooperation, specifically for the Olympics, is pretty significant. We see already reports in the news about US, Israel, the UK, France, all working together to share resources, share intelligence, as well as sharing in the cost of security posture. We see the plan to have over 42,000 uniformed personnel, and that includes over 5,000 foreign security personnel from Western Europe and from North America. And so that level of security footprint, I think, is significantly different than 2015. The fourth is the regulatory environment. I mentioned the legislation, but I just wanted to focus in on that to say that since 2015, passive legislation for both the EU and for France in particular has led to restriction on weapons, increased monitoring of radical groups, right, and as well as enhanced border security measures. The fifth and final difference is focus on technology and cybersecurity. One, I think terrorist organizations are diversifying ways in which they can disrupt, make statements, instill fear. While certainly violence and threat to life is their number one goal, there are other ways to be disruptive, including destruction of infrastructure, but also cybersecurity attacks. I think the sporting events this summer are heavily dependent on digital technologies, both for operations and security. And so I think we'll see a heavy emphasis on cybersecurity, cyber terrorism as a critical component of risk this summer.
Nick, I think that's a great review of the differences. one of the themes from both case studies is that these are public sector challenges, right? The risk, the impact of those challenges are borne out often by the private sector, by, directors of security at Fortune 5,000 firms. And so the question is, how can OnSolve help? And I want to just quickly walk through some of the technology capabilities that are just best practices for travel risk management that really are highlighted by all the risks that we've outlined today. The first is the destination research portal, and this is a great place for any travel risk management program to start. Countries are color coded by risk level, and so the amber, orange, and red are higher levels of risk, and those will typically require different policies within your organization. So, for example, level 3 and higher countries typically get pre-travel advisories sent directly to the travel prior to the trip. Some organizations choose to have a pre-travel approval mechanism in place for level 4 and 5 countries. So this is like Chris books a trip to Afghanistan. Well, maybe OnSolve wants to know why is Chris booking a trip to Afghanistan, and what sort of work am I doing there, and what are my own protocols. Next, what you see here is city level reports and pre-travel advisories. On the left, you see polygons with overlays of different. It's almost like risk can be inherent or intrinsic into particular microgeographies, and so we provide that in the city level reporting. On the right hand side, you see a screenshot from a pre-travel advisory. Most travelers don't want 20 pages of a deep analysis and a history of conflict in an area or whatever the risk category is. They want to see just like very quickly what are the risks in that particular area. Next, you see one of the alerts that we talked about, right? So this is a proactive alert on the left-hand side, farmers to rally in Berlin on 4 April. So you see this was detected on 3 April. So it's a forward-looking event. And that alert should apply to both the facility as well as the traveler, as well as any asset, any mobile user. That's kind of a best practice, right? So you want to know risk, you want to know where my facilities, my assets, my locations, and then certain types of alerts need to be sent directly to the traveler. You can see here, this has a bit of advice: anticipate heightened security and associated disruptions in the area. Additionally, you may want alerts sent to your leadership team. And so all of this information as a best practice needs to be synchronized with a common operating picture. So you see your fixed assets, your dynamic assets, your mobile users, your risk, and really as a best practice, you need to be able to communicate. So on the right-hand side, you can see drilling in, send a quick alert, communicate with everyone in the area, communicate with affected people, adjust those map groups so that you're getting the right message out to the right people at the right time. Nick, we're just in the final minute here. Give us kind of a summary for some recommended best practices for TRM for Europe 2024.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you to our audience for giving us your time. And we want to close with best practices and practical tips with a focus on travel risk management, whether it's for your employees or travelers in Europe. The first is those travel security briefings that Chris mentioned. Conduct comprehensive security briefings for all your employees that are in Europe for these events. Make sure that those briefings include information about local security measures, right? I had mentioned the security buffer around the river in France, what impact that can have. So what is the local security measures? What are the emergency contacts in local context for your travelers? And then make sure that there is a way to update those traveler on the latest travel advisories, whether it's through OnSolve's risk intelligence and travel risk management platforms, or other reliable sources such as the government travel alerts from the U.S. Embassy or other governmental agencies. Make sure you provide specific guidance on areas to avoid. I mentioned the spike in petty crime due to density. Those happen in particular areas or particular transportation hubs. So make sure those travel briefings highlight what those high-risk areas are for your employees. The second best practice is to establish communication protocols, especially for an emergency. So make sure your employees have reliable, secure communications when they're traveling abroad. Simple things like making sure travelers know how to turn on their phones, have an international plan, know how to make calls. Make sure they have a mobile app downloaded so you can push them key alerts via notifications. And ensure that all those employees have access to local and international emergency numbers and that they've uploaded those numbers into their phones or have those phone numbers available via the mobile app. The third best practice is to equip your traveling employees with travel and health insurance. Ensure that your travel risk management program provides comprehensive travel and health insurance that not only covers local medical emergencies, but also provides evacuation coverage if necessary, as well as emergency evacuation for natural disasters or other risks. And make sure that you clarify steps that employees should take to access this care and what numbers they should call. The fourth best practice is to have an emergency response plan that you rehearse with employees and with your teams. Make sure this includes a clear communication plan, but also an emergency evacuation route back to their hotel or to a mustering point in the case of emergency, such as a terrorist attack or natural disaster. Having a place that employees can go that you know will be safe, secured, off-site from major events, and where they can establish accountability and care. The fifth best practice I want to highlight is to monitor and evaluate. I really highly recommend investing in a solution or having access to continuous alerting and monitoring about what's happening in Europe this summer. Whether it's specific coverage around major events, special events that you're hosting or participating in, or just general coverage about what are the risk trends in Europe that can help prepare your organization and keep your people resilient this summer. The last is to have a heat plan. I truly believe that climate risks like heat will be the most likely and have the biggest impact this summer. So have a plan with your team for what to do during a heat wave. If your team is out in the field or if employees are attending these events, encourage frequent hydration and provide training and education around safe drinking water practices, even in Europe, and to know the signs and symptoms of heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Make sure your teams are booking adequate lodging. If they're going with alternative lodging, whether it's through long-term apartments or homes, make sure there's adequate and working air conditioning. Lastly, encourage your employees to have a backup plan to avoid commuting on public transportation during heat waves. Not only does public transit in Europe rarely have adequate air conditioning, but the density of people and the congestion, it elevates the risk of heat while commuting or traveling on congested public transit. So make sure you have a plan for the heat this summer.
Nick,
so Chris, back over to you, to close us out.
It's a great summary, super practical. Love that you finished with the heat plan. And again, I just think about those roofs, 193 degrees, man. It's real. So to our audience, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. If we can answer any additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. You see my email, chris.hurst@OnSolve. You see Nick's there, nick.hill@onsolve.com. If you're an existing client, you obviously have your account manager as well to help coordinate. Please let us know how we can be helpful. Thank you so much. Be safe this spring and the summer, particularly those of you in Europe. Have a great day. Cheers.
Thank you all.